The doors on the right side will open.
When you think of Subarashiki Hibi, what probably comes to mind first is Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and, of course, that inescapable phrase, "Live happily." It's fair. "Live happily" leaves a striking, almost overwhelming impression. But as I've sat with this work, I found myself wanting to offer a different reading. A reading that steps away from the conventional interpretation and away from the image of the story that rests entirely on the Tractatus as its foundation. To put it plainly, my goal here is to peel away the adhesion between Wittgenstein's philosophy and Subarashiki Hibi. I want to establish the game as a standalone work with its own distinct thesis. But to do that fairly, we first have to look at what the Tractatus is actually doing philosophically, without pulling any punches. Only then can we examine the thesis of Subarashiki Hibi on its own terms. Along the way, I hope you'll ask yourself a question. Did the feeling of live happily that you took away from the story actually align with what the game was trying to say, or with what Wittgenstein was trying to say? Let's start with the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. I want to present its core ideas simply, so we can examine them with our own eyes. Though I should warn you, the narrative of Subarashiki Hibi deliberately engineers its story so it can be read alongside several distinct philosophical destinations at once. It follows the Tractatus closely in some moments, diverges from it in others, and in routes like Himawari no Sakamichi, it departs from it completely. But to understand the departure, we have to understand the foundation. And that includes the darker dimensions of Wittgenstein's thought that the story largely leaves in shadow. Let's think about the world as fact. What is the world we live in? Our world, the world human beings inhabit, overflows with things. And we have given a name to each and every one of them. We call what spreads above our heads the sky, what we tread upon the earth, and the expanse of water whose far shore we cannot see the sea. In the story, Takuji says, the totality of realized words is the world. The world is not the totality of things. Realized words become a single world. In our world, the world is language. We use words without even being aware of it. Even without speaking aloud, whenever we see something or feel something, our minds unconsciously convert it into words. Because of this, for every human being, the world that spreads out before them is simply the totality of realized words. Or, as Wittgenstein writes in his very first proposition, the world is the totality of facts. Facts are realized words. This is an audio essay. Dogs walk on 4 legs. These are facts. But saying the totality of realized words is the world only captures a single frozen instant. A world held perfectly still. What we feel right now is not the whole of the world. So what is the world in a larger sense? We know the world includes landscapes we will never see in our lifetimes. Sight is not the world. Hearing is not the world. Not touch, not taste, not smell, not even pain. Tomo-san had an answer for this. He said, the world is everything that can become words. Everything that can become meaning. That is the world. This is what Wittgenstein calls states of affairs. A combination of facts and non-facts. The essence of a state of affairs is the words we can think and imagine in our minds. Propositions that can be either true or false. Because we can imagine them, they constitute everything that can occur in the world. This is why, in the story, Ayana refers to the world as the commonplace world. Even if no one has ever given it form, anyone can understand it. Anyone knows it. Even a landscape that has never existed in the world isn't surprising. It's commonplace. In the story, there's a moment that completely shatters our ordinary sense of reality. Kimika and Takuji are on the rooftop, and suddenly she sees cows. Everywhere, huge cows, walking on 2 legs, dancing with surprising dexterity. Kimika laughs. declaring that they've broken through the Earth's gravitational field, that this is a dance outside the cage. What is that cage? It's our fixed assumptions about the world. We dismiss dancing cows as absurd simply because we've never seen them. We're constrained by the premises of natural science, by the very laws of gravity, but in what Wittgenstein calls logical space, the only condition for existence is conceivability. If we can imagine it, it exists there as a genuine possibility. Humans are creatures who constantly seek laws. When we encounter something inexplicable, we try to force it into our existing framework. Tomosani talks about this using the heliocentric theory. For centuries, people believed the sky revolved around the Earth because they needed the answer to come first. Reality was forced into conformity with that premise. We base our entire understanding of the world on the assumption that what happened in the past will keep happening in the future. But Wittgenstein refused to accept the fragility of these human-made laws. He turned to language to find an unshakable truth. In his framework, you cannot even think a truly contradictory sentence, like a triangle is a square, because it can't be thought. It falls entirely outside of logical space. When Takuji and Kimika pass through this space of dancing cows, they reach the limit of the thinkable, the limit of the world, and from that vantage point, Tomosane realizes something profound. If the world is only what I can see, touch, and feel, then the limit of the world is synonymous with my limit. There is no difference between me and the world. When you look at reality this way, stripped of all human-invented regularities, there is no rigid cause and effect. Things just happen contingently. To live this way is to exist in what Wittgenstein calls the aspect of eternity, subspecie aeternitatis. This phrase, subspecie aeternitatis, echoes repeatedly throughout the game. But what does it actually mean for us? Yuki tells us that animals live in the eternal aspect because they don't know about death. For them, death is imaginary, a destination they never actually reach. To live under the eternal aspect means that death has no place in our life. But Wittgenstein doesn't define eternity as an infinite progression of time. He defines it as timelessness, living entirely in the present moment. The past and the future simply do not exist. It's tempting to look at this through the lens of Epicurus, who famously said that death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death comes, we no longer exist. It's a comforting, simple thought. The world will just go on without us. But Wittgenstein's view is much darker and much more absolute. He wrote, "So too at death the world does not alter, but comes to an end. If you truly live only in the present, then there is no present after you die. The world itself ends with you. To fear death is to treat it as a future event, which means you are trapped in the temporality of past, present, and future." Wittgenstein saw the fear of death as the sign of a false, inferior life. This is exactly what Takuji meant when he shouted to his followers that death is something to be embraced. Stripped of its comforting illusions, living in the eternal aspect requires us to accept that the end of our life is the absolute end of the universe. It's a heavy, almost a grotesque idea to accept. And it's here that we really have to start questioning if this Tractatus-bound version of eternity is the one Subarashiki Hibi truly wants us to walk away with. So, if we accept this heavy premise that the past and the future don't exist and the world ends with us, how are we actually supposed to look at the world? How do we perceive things under this eternal aspect? Let's look at Kimika and Takuji again. Having passed through logical space, they arrive at what they call the limit of the world. Kimika looks around and realizes something profound. The sky at the end of the world and the sky back home are no different. The sunset you see at the edge of the universe is just as beautiful as the sunset you see on your ordinary walk home. Why is that? Because they are looking at the world from the outside, taking it in as a whole. Think of it like standing in an art gallery, looking at a painting. When you stand before a canvas, you don't evaluate it element by element. You take it in all at once. You don't wonder about the past lives of the figures painted there, or what will happen to them tomorrow. The painting exists entirely in the present, independent of cause and effect. When we view the world from its limit, we are standing before it as if it were a single painting. Every ordinary landscape becomes an extension of that whole, filled with a sweeping, absolute beauty. There's a fascinating exchange about forgotten things that perfectly illustrates this. Kimika wonders if she's left anything behind, but then she concludes, if I've forgotten it, then it's not really a forgotten thing, is it? It means it was something I didn't need. Normally, forgetting requires a past. You have to remember that you forgot something to go looking for it. But under the eternal aspect, there is only now. The causal chain is completely abandoned. A memory that cannot be recalled right now has no value, so forgotten things dissolve into simply things not needed. If that still feels abstract, Wittgenstein himself offered a brilliant metaphor. He compared the present to a film projector. Imagine sitting in a theater. The present is not the entire roll of film. The present is only the picture currently shining on the screen. The film that has already passed through the projector is the past. The film still waiting on the reel is the future. As long as the projector runs, everything that will ever happen is already inscribed on that film. But you, the observer, the I, do nothing but watch the images currently cast onto the screen. The film wasn't running before you were born, and the moment you die, the projector stops. Who then made the film? Who wove the fate etched into those frames? Wittgenstein calls this creator God. And that brings us to the core of the story, the imprint. The original sin carved into all living things. Yuki tells Tomosane that every life, the cat, the dog, the zebra, the human is commanded by a single imprint, and that the imprint simply says, live happily. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But this command carries a heavy nuance. It relies on a deep faith in human nature, that our pursuit of happiness is driven by good intentions. But as Hasaki and Tomosane note, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Sometimes, the accumulation of right choices gives rise to the greatest tragedies. Yet, under the eternal aspect, God declares that life is happy, regardless of the hardships that befall us. This isn't a fleeting emotion. It's an absolute, unshakable happiness. Even a brutal tragedy is swallowed up by the ordinary world and deemed happy by the universe. It's almost stoic. In a world whose beauty is already decided by God, our personal opinions about it don't actually matter. We don't need to seek out beauty, because the world is already incomparably beautiful as a foundational rule. Our lives are essentially God's works of art. Yuki tells us that a person can hear the gospel of this blessing through three forces: words, beauty, and prayer. Let's pull back from the grand scale of the universe for a moment and look at the person observing it. The I. If the world is language, then the world is given to me. But what exactly does that mean? There is a genuinely philosophical exchange in the story between Kimura and Tomosane that breaks this down, starting with something very visceral. Hey, Kimura goes that the pain we feel right now belongs to no one else, and that is exactly why it matters. But let's examine the phrase, this pain is my pain. If you say, this umbrella is my umbrella, it makes perfect sense. It implies that the umbrella could belong to someone else. It could be your umbrella. It's a meaningful statement because there's a contrast, a possibility that it could be otherwise. But what about this pain? Can we genuinely imagine the exact pain occurring inside me right now belonging to you? We can't, because we can't even conceive of pain that isn't ours. The phrase, this pain is my pain, is actually a meaningless tautology. It's unconditionally true. Wittgenstein points out that if you logically exclude another person from having something, it loses its sense to say that you have it. The word my becomes entirely superfluous. We see this illustrated perfectly when Tomo-san and Yuki share a body. Tomo-san feels the terrible pain of being beaten, but Yuki doesn't. It shows us that the body isn't the I. The I is the consciousness, the soul. What Wittgenstein called the metaphysical subject, or the limit of the world. This leads Kimura to ask about the meaning of existence. He asks if we are all just pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. A single puzzle piece, sitting by itself, has no meaning. It only makes sense if there's a larger frame, a true outside world to fit into. But Tomosane rejects this completely. He asks, where is the world that your world is supposed to fit into? There is no outside. The world of representation we experience doesn't contrast with some hidden objective reality. All we can ever know is what reaches us through our own senses. And because I can never step outside myself to know your world, the possessive my disappears once again. My world simply transforms into the world. It's exactly what Emily Dickinson wrote in the poem Tomosane recites. The brain is wider than the sky. So, where does that leave the meaning of life? If the world is just a vessel, and everything happening inside it is just contingent happenstance, then the world itself has no inherent absolute value. Wittgenstein argued that the meaning of the world must lie outside the world. What fills this empty vessel? It's the will to live. When we fill our world with the will to live, our will aligns perfectly with the imprint God placed on us. Live happily, even in moments of absolute despair. To hold on to the will to live is to answer that call. It brings all simple, ordinary values together into a single value, happiness.
And there, the wonderful everyday comes into being.
That is the interpretation we are used to. That is the image of Subarashiki Hibi that stays faithfully in the slipstream of the Tractatus. If you follow that logic to the letter, the answer to life is to desire nothing beyond simply living. To surrender all your free will to God's will, trusting that whatever happens, even tragedy, is part of a beautiful whole. But is that a satisfying answer? Are we really willing to surrender every pleasure and choice in the world to depend on some untainted, higher happiness? Are we truly supposed to accept that God weaves our fates, offers no salvation when we suffer, and simply watches us while whispering, "Live happily"? I don't think that's where the story ends. To find the true thesis of Subarashiki Hibi, we have to step off the smooth, frictionless ice of the Tractatus and step onto rough ground. We have to look at how we actually walk through the wonderful days. If we follow the Tractatus to the letter, we can no longer live our days as we always have. The idea of logical space, where anything we can imagine is equally possible, strips away the very thing we rely on to survive. Causality. Think about gravity. If you fall from a rooftop, you cannot resist the fate of gravity. Your body hits the ground and breaks. Drop a teacup and it shatters. We know this because it has always been this way, and so we trust it will always be this way. In philosophy, this is called induction, but the Tractatus dismisses induction entirely. Wittgenstein wrote, "Belief in the causal nexus is superstition." To him, dropping a cup doesn't mean it has to fall. If it does fall, it is merely a favor granted by fate, because there is no logical connection between our will and the world. Logically, perhaps he's right. You can't prove the sun will rise tomorrow just because it rose today. But how can anyone actually live like that? If the future is completely unmoored from the past, if every possibility is equally likely, then taking a single step forward is terrifying. You can't even be sure the ground will hold your weight. But we do take that step. We walk forward without doubting the ground. We carelessly ignore the vast multitude of logical possibilities, and we just live. As the philosopher David Hume pointed out, we are sustained by habit. We are inductive animals. When Zakuro takes her step forward in the story, she realizes that the first step a baby takes, or the first step an animal took onto land, must have been terrifying. It's a step toward an unknown tomorrow. But as you keep walking, the terrifying unknown transforms into a familiar landscape. It becomes ordinary. What makes that step possible isn't logic, it's courage, the will to face the future. Now, let's look at what happens when you fall from the sky. Takuji and Kimika fall, and they shatter on the concrete. It is a perfectly ordinary ending, a perfectly ordinary fate, dictated by gravity. Takuji resigns himself to it. He surrenders to the physical laws of cause and effect, accepting the end as God's will. But Tomosane also falls. He is trapped in the exact same inescapable destiny. He knows that everyone who has jumped from the rooftop has died. The inductive jinx is practically set in stone. Yet, plunging through the air with Hasaki in his arms, Tomosane does not surrender. He looks up at the spinning stars and the laughing moon, and he screams, "To hell with all of it! God can go to hell, fate can go to hell. I will carve out my own destiny with my own hands." Here, Subarashiki Hibi decisively breaks away from the Tractatus. Tomosane defects from two things simultaneously: God and fate. God here is the God of the Tractatus, the transcendent being who orchestrates all destinies without regard for human will. Fate is gravity, the inductive, self-evident law that says if you fall, you die. Tomosane knows he is powerless in the air. He knows it is completely futile. But because he wants to save Hasaki, his mind makes a decision, and his body follows. He kicks through the glass of the school building. He crashes into the eaves, breaking his fall, taking the brutal impact to protect her. He introduces will into the chain of physical causality. This is something Takuji, in his resignation, could never do. And in that moment of sheer, defiant will, the imagery of the game shifts. Throughout the story, the stars are a metaphor for the distant, transcendent god of logical space. But as Tomosane fights for his life, the stars fall silent. They fade, drowned out by the glow of the city, by the activities of human beings. But the moon remains. The moon is much closer to us. It represents a different kind of god, a weak god, one who stands close to people, who permits us to carve out our own futures through cause and effect. Tomosano looks at the moon. At first, he thinks it's laughing at him, but then he realizes it looks sad. It looks like it's crying. It is a god that watches over us as we forge our own tragic, beautiful fates, knowing nothing of the outcome, simply walking beside us and whispering, "Live happily." Tomosen survives. He arrives at a wonderful everyday. He sits at a piano in a bar and he plays a melody. It is an act of cause and effect. He strikes the keys and the sound reaches the ears of the people he cares about. We do not merely receive the wonderful days. We must play our own melody within them. The sound of our lives blending into the ordinary day. But we can't live every moment in that state of absolute defiance, nor can we live entirely in the pure eternal aspect. Our daily lives are riddled with cause and effect, and that is exactly why we can go about our days without constant hesitation. In the Himawari no Sakamichi, the slope of sunflowers, we see what this actually looks like. When we climb the slope of daily life, things that once seemed impossible or terrifying eventually become as familiar as an afternoon stroll. As time accumulates, we grow used to the scenery. And yet, no matter how many years pass, there are still views that take our breath away. The world still captivates us. To see that constancy, to feel that the world is still there, simply and beautifully, is how we can access the eternal perspective in our ordinary lives. Wittgenstein wrote, "It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists." This brings us to a beautiful distinction in the Japanese language between two kinds of happiness. There is kofuku, the state of being blessed, of finding contentment simply by virtue of existing. And then there is shiawase, the happiness you actively reach out and find, like searching for a four-leaf clover. If we are already living in the absolute blessing of kofuku, then searching for shiawase is essentially just play. We reach for it even knowing that play must eventually come to an end. And that end is death. Being born into this world is something close to a curse, because every moment of happiness, every moment of joy will end. A final period will be placed on it. But it is precisely because that period exists that we can feel the blessing of life as active happiness. Our play is fleeting, but the world remains. We don't know where the soul comes from, and we don't know where it goes. To obsess over a realm no one has ever seen is, in a way, a perversion. But it is a perversion that keeps us from despair. When we mourn the dead, we are offering a righteous prayer. We recognize that their life was blessed, and that our lives are blessed right now, in this very moment. And so, we keep walking. We descend the slope one shoe step at a time, trusting that the ground will hold us because it has held us before. For a long time, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus cast a long shadow over how this story was understood. It's easy to catch a kind of resignation from it, to believe that free will is an illusion and that we should just surrender to the script. But I don't think that's the final answer. Wittgenstein's ideas are a ladder. You climb them to change your perspective, but eventually, you have to throw the ladder away. I don't want to live on the smooth, frictionless ice of perfect logic. I want to walk on the rough ground with my own feet. I want to live in the everyday, where the moon watches over us, not as a distant, orchestrating force, but as a quiet companion that grieves with us, rejoices with us, and whispers, "Live happily." It's the end of it all. When we are finished, I hope we can look back and say, our lives were filled with happiness, and so we can keep walking into our 素晴らしき日々.
The doors on the right side will open.